Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today. I would like to thank everyone at the University of Colorado and Colorado Springs for this kind invitation. I first met Konstantin at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas, where we were both fellows. And I recognized a kindred spirit and a soulmate in terms of academic pursuits and interests. And it's, this is the culmination of the fruition of that initial meeting that I am here today to talk to you about what's happening in the Middle East. So my PowerPoint, I don't like PowerPoint, but my PowerPoint is a bit of a show and tell. I want to show you some pictures, I want to show you some maps. I promise you there won't be a lot of data so as not to bore you. And to explain to you some of the basic features, structural features of the Middle East, the principal rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, how these two countries have very different visions, both of themselves and of the region, how the United States interacts with these two countries, and where I see our interests, the interests of the United States, as falling, and what we would like to see happen in this region. And then I would like to tell you something about what's happening really now in the literally last few days in the Middle East with President Trump's proposal for Gaza, for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for where the Saudis fit into that proposal. And I just returned myself from Riyadh, from Saudi Arabia, where I met with a number of leaders and officials. So I have some really fresh information to share with you. So let's go to the first slide. So first, I just want to show you some maps so that we're all, as it were, on the same page. This is the region that I'm talking about. Iran is the country that you see up above and above Saudi Arabia to the northeast. It's a very big country. Saudi Arabia is also a very big country. We're talking about countries, in the case of Saudi Arabia, that's nearly the size of Western Europe, all of Western Europe. And there's this body of water called the Persian Gulf, which the Saudis don't like to call Persian, they like to call it the Arabian Gulf. So there's a dispute over the naming of bodies of water, not something that we're not familiar with ourselves. That you have the Red Sea, which is not disputed in terms of naming, and you have a series of countries around here. And this is really a region that's at the, if you like, it's sort of a fulcrum, it's at the intersection of three continents. So you have Asia, Africa, and Europe. So strategically, geostrategically, extremely important. You have three of the most important choke points, maritime choke points, just in this area. You have the Strait of Hormuz, which is at the tip of the Persian Gulf, so just between Iran and what is there, the UAE. Something like 20 million barrels of oil transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This is a very narrow strait, and we consume 100 million barrels of oil roughly a day globally. So about a fifth, 20% of the world's oil transits right through that strait. There's another one that's where you see the word Aden and Ethiopia, another strait there called Bab el-Mandeb. That's also extremely important. It's how virtually everything that comes from the east, from China or from India, and that needs to transit to the west through the Mediterranean, has to go through there. And then you have the Suez Canal, which is a canal that is in Egypt that connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. So geopolitically and in terms of geostrategy, extremely important region of the world. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the Arabian Peninsula, so this is a bit of a close-up of the same. Okay, let's continue. Okay, now this is a map of the world. I promise you a bit of show and tell. I need to get your mind into this region of the world so that you understand its importance. This is a map of the world where the countries are in proportion to the size of the conventional oil reserves that they have in the ground. So in other words, the more oil a country has, the bigger it seems on the map. Okay? And you can see, you just compare all of North America to Saudi Arabia in size. Okay? So something like 50 to plus % of the world's oil, and a lot of its gas, is located in this one region around Saudi Arabia and Iran. Okay, extremely important region for oil. And it is also the cheapest oil to produce in the world in terms of extraction costs, and it's also the cheapest oil to transport, right? Because of the seas that you have around it. So it has tremendous comparative advantage over other oil, say Canadian oil, which is, a lot of it is tar sands, very heavy, very polluting, very energy intensive to extract. Venezuela also has a lot of oil, but a lot of it is unconventional and also very expensive to extract. So this area has a lot of comparative advantages, and the last barrel of oil that will ever be consumed in the world will come from this region of the world, simply because of its cost being so low and its extraction being so easy. Just to give you a sense also of the way God somehow endowed this region, there is one oil field in Saudi Arabia called Ghawar that's the size of the state of Delaware. That's one oil field. It's been producing 5 million barrels of oil every day since the 1950s and hasn't stopped. So it's just an endowment that's just beyond anything else to be found anywhere else in the world. Okay, next slide. All right. Having given you this background, now let me turn to Iran. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Iran and what Iran is up to, and then move to Saudi Arabia, and then talk about the relationship between Saudi and Iran and how the United States comes into this. So here you have a photograph of the leader of the Iranian Revolution. Iran was a monarchy that was pro-Western, and it turned into an Islamic revolutionary regime in 1979 through a major revolution, a very popular revolution, not entirely composed of Islamists, people who, like Khomeini, who were advocating for the implementation of Islam and Islamic law. It also had communists, it had nationalists, but eventually the Islamists took over the revolution because they were the most violent, which is typically what happens in most revolutions. The most radical, the most violent, the best organized tend to take over the other elements of the revolution. He took over, and he had a doctrine basically that argued for a supreme scholar, a supreme jurist, Islamic scholar, a cleric to rule. So his vision of politics is theocratic. So you have one man who essentially represents God on earth, who rules. The Iranian regime also has a republican form of regime alongside this theocracy, but effectively the president of Iran and the parliament of Iran are all answerable to him, and he has the final say on all matters. So we do have an autocratic theocrat in charge of Iran, and his ideology argues for the implementation of Islamic law, but it also has elements of leftist, Marxist thought. He talks about social justice, about economic justice, about uplifting the poor, and getting rid of the imperialists, getting rid of the extreme forms of capitalism. So his ideology is this eclectic hodgepodge of leftism and Islamism and theocracy, and this is how he rules the country. He also insisted that his revolution was an international revolution. It was a global revolution. It wasn't just to be confined to Iran. It had to be spread throughout the world, and it had to link up with other revolutionaries around the world. And most importantly, he argued that the US, which he called the Great Satan, had to be defeated. The United States had to be expelled from the Middle East. Its influence, cultural, economic, military, political, had to be pushed out. He called America not just the Great Satan, but the leader of the forces of arrogance. These are Quranic, Islamic terms, heavily symbolic, of laden with kind of great symbolism, religious symbolism. And he argued for the defense of the oppressed. And so this is a revolution that aimed at liberating the people of the world from the oppression of the United States and of the forces of evil. And Israel had to be destroyed in this vision, and all regimes that were also allied with the United States, such as the one in Saudi Arabia, had also had to be toppled or had to be removed. So this is a global revolution. It spread its ideology, tried to spread its ideology throughout the Middle East, and it had some takers And a number of the people who took up this ideology formed militias and paramilitary organizations in different countries, the most important of which is the one that formed in Lebanon and which was called Hezbollah. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's a thank you. It's a movement that has a political wing, a social wing, even they have medical hospitals, but it also has a militia that is trained and armed and organized by Iran, and that formed in around 1982-83 in Lebanon and developed into the single most powerful force in Lebanese politics. It was also a militia that did Iran's bidding in fighting wars, not just in Lebanon against Israel, but also in Syria when a revolution started there in 2011. And it also sent people to train other militias that were loyal to Iran in places like Yemen. So this is Hezbollah, this is their yellow flag. They've recently suffered a tremendous defeat at the hands of Israel. I'll get to that in a moment. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. So Hezbollah has had several interactions with Israel. Israel being the country to the south of Lebanon. And Hezbollah was created by Iran as a way to to protect Iran itself from any direct attack from Israel or the United States, but also because Iran had this plan to destroy Israel. And Hezbollah was going to be sort of the spear, the tip of the spear, the militia that was going to ultimately take over and defeat the Israeli army. So when October 7th happened, 2023, when Hamas, another group that's allied with Iran and armed and trained by Iran, attacked Israel, Hezbollah opened up a front against Israel from Lebanon on October 8th and started shelling Israel, but didn't enter fully into the battle against Israel. It was just an attempt to keep Israel from focusing all its power on Hamas in Gaza, needing to keep some troops on its northern border to face Hezbollah. However, what Hezbollah didn't realize is that Israel, since at least 2006, when it had a 33-day-long war with Israel, Hezbollah did, Israel had been planning very carefully to fight against Hezbollah and to ultimately defeat it, because Hezbollah represented the single most important threat, strategic threat, military threat to Israel, because Hezbollah was arming with missiles. They claimed to have about between 150,000 and 200,000 missiles, many of them precision guided. So in other words, if these missiles were launched against Israel, they could bomb virtually any city in Israel and made the entirety of Israel vulnerable to attack. So Israel had prepared the ground for taking on this militia, using mostly its intelligence apparatus to penetrate this movement, to find people within it who could basically be spies and who could give information to Israel. Since 2006, the Israelis developed several ways of penetrating this movement, including finding ways to provide weapons and arms, not so much weapons, but telecommunication equipment that the Israelis had already rigged with bombs made by Israeli companies and ultimately sold to Hezbollah so that its fighters would be using walkie-talkies and would be using pagers that the Israelis had rigged with bombs and that could be triggered by Israel at a moment's notice. In addition to that, the Israelis also had managed to penetrate the missile command of Hezbollah so that virtually every missile that was in storage in Lebanon had a satellite tag on it so that the Israelis knew where the missile was. So it's a kind of a remarkable intelligence achievement of the Israelis to have penetrated this movement, which had prided itself on being impenetrable because of its tight security, its incredible organization and organizational capacity. Nonetheless, the Israelis did that, And there was a debate right after October 7th between Israeli leaders and generals as to whether to take on this movement immediately or to wait. The then Minister of Defense of Israel, a man called Gallant, wanted to take on Hezbollah right away because they already had all this information that made this movement extremely vulnerable. However, for a couple of reasons, namely that the United States was unwilling to support Israel in its war against Hezbollah, and was threatening not to not sell certain weapon systems if Israel opened a front against Lebanon, against Hezbollah. The Israelis put off the attack, the major attack. A little over a year later, in September of 2024, the Israelis finally, a little under a year actually, the Israelis finally decided they were going to open up. And then they used the pagers and they used the walkie-talkies and they used the tags on the missiles to basically wipe out this movement almost entirely. I mean, seriously decimated. You can see here in the structure, all the leadership was killed of the movement. And this is all due to this ability to penetrate this movement. With the defeat of Hezbollah, Iran lost a major card. It's actually the major card that it held in its hand in its ability to project power and military influence in the Arab and Muslim world. And so the defeat of Hezbollah was a major blow to Iran. The Israelis also attacked Iranian assets in Syria and in Iraq. And then eventually, when the leader of this movement was killed, the Iranians also attacked Israel on two occasions, once before and once after this leader was killed, with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones. And in each case, the Israelis were able to repel, with the help of the United States and several other Arab countries, were able to repel the Iranian attack on Israel. The upshot of this entire encounter with Iran and Israel is that Iran was very seriously weakened. Its entire air defense system was knocked out. Its major military asset in Lebanon was virtually destroyed. And then eventually after that, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria was toppled. This was kind of like a fringe benefit of the Israeli attack on Iranian assets. They so weakened the Iranians that they could no longer come to the aid of the Assad regime, which was an ally of Iran. So Iran was very seriously defeated, and its entire project of spreading its revolution, of pushing back the United States, of defeating Israel has been seriously damaged. They now are facing a major setback, and the Iranians are having to think about what to do in terms of their ideology, in terms of their political project. Are they to continue on trying to rebuild this movement? Are they instead going to build a nuclear weapons capability, which is something that they've been working on as well, as a way to both protect themselves from attack, but also to continue to project influence into the region? The upshot of all of this, as I said, is that Iran is a revolutionary regime. It's committed to a revolutionary ideology. It has faced a very serious setback recently, but it's still, when you listen to the rhetoric of the regime, when you listen to what the supreme leader says on his during Friday sermons and so on, it's still very much about defeating America, destroying Israel, turning the tide in favor of the revolution, etc., fighting the forces of arrogance, supporting the oppressed, etc., etc. So that hasn't changed, but it faces very serious weakness, and its project is one that is anchored in a kind of politics of resentment, a politics of radical revolutionary revisionism. The world is not good, it's bad. We need to change it. We need to fight the forces of evil, and we need to rebuild it and reconstruct it in our own image. Okay, this is the Iranian project not the Iranian people necessarily. Most Iranian people don't support this regime, but the regime in Iran has this project. Now, compared to the Iranians, you have another project, which is what I'm going to talk about. But before doing that, I just want to show you, I think, one more slide of another group that is backed by Iran. And this is this group called the Houthis in Yemen. And they are a group that is ideologically in sync, more or less, with the Iranian regime, funded and armed by the Iranian regime. And they are based in Yemen, and they've been basically trying to take over Yemen through a civil war. And most recently, what they've been able to do is to use missiles and drones to hinder maritime shipping through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. I just wanted to also point out to you the kind of ideology that this movement promotes, to tell you, to give you a sense of what it is that they argue. So this thing that you see here, the banner that you see to your right, is what is called their scream or their shout. This is their slogan, their revolutionary slogan. And it says, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, a curse be on all Jews, and victory for Islam." That's what they stand for. That's kind of, it sums up their ideology. And you can see them that they're not, they're not super well trained necessarily. They don't look very sophisticated as a military group, but they are tough fighters, and they're kind of like the Taliban in Afghanistan, or you can think of the Viet Cong in Vietnam. To take them on, you'd have to send troops on the ground in Yemen, and you would have to incur very large casualties to be able to defeat them. You can defeat them, but not easily, unless you are willing to take casualties. And the U.S. has not been willing to do so for understandable reasons. So most of the attacks on them to try to stop them from attacking maritime shipping have been through attacks from the air. The U.S. Air Force, British Air Force, French Air Force, and Israeli Air Force have been attacking them, but with very limited success because they're very good at hiding their missiles. Next slide. Okay, now let me switch to Saudi Arabia to give you the contrast. So the Saudis, again, this is this big country with a lot of the oil. The Saudis were created, the country was created by a family called the Al Saud family. And the Al Saud family used an Islamic ideology, an Islamic a version of Islam that was extremely intolerant and very forceful. And these are their troops in around 1915, 1916, conquering most of Arabia, which was tribal and did not have any states. And so they conquered Islam in the name of this religious ideology that they had. And they ultimately united most of the country by 1932 and declared a kingdom. Okay, next slide. This is the man who created Saudi Arabia. His name is King Abdul Aziz. He died in 1953. He was, an Arabian tribal chieftain, but one with considerable vision for his country. And at the time, he realized that the superpower in the region was Great Britain, and that the British were people who, in terms of their politics, were exploitative and quite able to take advantage of Arabs. So he reached out and met with President Roosevelt in 1945. In fact, on Valentine's Day, February 1945, he met with him on an American battleship and explained to him Saudi Arabia's position and sought to create a new relationship based on mutual benefit with the United States. The United States had already arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1933, prospecting for oil. It was ultimately discovered in 1938 in commercial quantities. And by 1945, Saudi Arabia could produce significant amounts of oil, but that was not the primary incentive for the relationship between the US. The US was actually still much more concerned about being able to use Saudi Arabia for airlifting and for aircraft bases, because the war in Japan was still ongoing and flights needed to fly from west to east, and they wanted to land in bases in Saudi Arabia. So it was more of a strategic military interest that the United States had in Saudi Arabia, less oil per se, but eventually oil became a very important factor. Okay, next slide. The other thing that the Saudis have in terms of assets, it's a desert country, aside from oil, they have religion. So religion is a very important factor in terms of the legitimacy of the regime. They have the two most important holy sites of Islam, the Great Mosque in Mecca, which you see here. And the next slide, please, is the Great Mosque of Medina, which is where the Prophet Muhammad is buried. These are two major pilgrimage sites for Muslims and the holiest sites of Muslims, and the Saudis control them. They protect them, they look after them, they expand them. They also manage the pilgrimage of Muslims to these sites. We're talking a pilgrimage that happens once a year of about 3.5 million people, and then an annual visit of around 40 million people to both these sites. So it's a major kind of operation and extremely well run and professionally managed. So for the longest time, the Saudis were very happy with the idea that they were the custodians of Islam's holiest sites. They had all this oil, they were allies with the United States, and it all seemed to work pretty well. The alliance with the US worked particularly well because of the spread during the 1950s and 60s. The communists and the Soviets tried to spread their influence in the Middle East, and the Saudis, using Islam and using American support, were able to block this expansion of communism and Marxist ideas, socialist ideas in the region. And Islam was basically their rallying cry, their reason for their legitimacy, and they weren't interested in developing much more than that. Next slide. Okay. Now, a few slides on oil so that, again, we come back to this. So I told you most of the reserves of oil are in the Middle East. You have to keep that in mind when thinking about this region and how we think about this region, but also how China thinks about this region. Remember that China is the second largest consumer of oil in the world, and it doesn't have a lot of oil itself. And it has to depend on this region for its imports of oil. So does Japan, so does India. So this is an extremely important region for the Far East, the Far Eastern countries, but also for other parts of the world. Okay, next slide. And this is the gas, by the way, that is found in the world. And you can see the Middle East is extremely well endowed with 28%. The US is extremely well endowed now because of shale gas. But again, you can't dismiss gas from the equation. Next slide, please. Okay. And then the other thing I want to bring to your attention is that when you look at the trade in commodities in the world, you can see that crude oil is by far the largest commodity in terms of size and value that is traded, much more than iron or anything else. And the other very important point is that it's traded in US dollars. Okay? And that's a very, very important point, which is that the US dollar is the reserve currency in the world. It's the currency that everyone wants, and it is an important element in the power and influence of the United States in the world. Because we can basically mint it as much as we want, and there's always going to be demand for the dollar because there are all these other people around the world that use it because everyone exchanges and buys things in dollars. So when the Chinese buy oil from the Saudis, they're paying in dollars. Because the Saudis don't want Chinese renminbi because they can't do much with Chinese renminbi. They can't turn around and go to Germany and say to the Germans, we want to buy X amount of stuff and we'll pay you in Chinese renminbi. Germans are not interested. Germans want dollars. And so the fact that the Saudis and these other countries use the dollar is an important factor in the power of the United States in the world. And it is an important element that ties politically the two countries, a country like Saudi Arabia and the United States. Next slide. Okay, and then the other point I wanted to make is that if you want to look at the oil companies of the world, this is Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi national oil company, and you can see its size in terms of the barrels of oil that it has in reserve compared to all the other companies that we call the international oil companies that you would be familiar with, ExxonMobil, Chevron, etc. You can see it's by far a much more important company in terms of size and what it can do in the world. So this gives Saudi Arabia a particularly important role also in oil in the oil market because it has what is called spare capacity. This is oil that it can produce at will, virtually at will, within 3 months. So it can increase or decrease its oil production, which has the effect of stabilizing global oil markets. Especially like today, for instance, the Saudis have 2 million barrels that they could produce, but they're not producing. And the reason they're not producing them is because they want the price to be at around 70 or between 70 and 80. And that's important because if they were to produce the 2 million barrels, the price would go down to 30, say, and then you would have US oil producers complaining because they can't produce profitably at $30 a barrel. Okay, so this is the kind of role that Saudi Arabia plays. That's why it's often called the central bank of oil. And it has that capacity by virtue of its reserves, but also the technical competence and professionalism of this company. Next slide. Okay, and this is our oil consumption in the world. You can see that we're still very heavily dependent on oil. We consume between 19 and 20 million barrels a day. The world consumes 100 million barrels. And yes, the United States is producing a lot of oil today. In fact, the United States, if you calculate all its production, oil plus natural gas liquids plus biofuels, everything put together, we're roughly at around 19 million barrels of production, which is the equivalent of both Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. So the US is by far the most important producer of oil, but still, this is a global commodity and it's a fungible commodity, which means that if you have less of it in Saudi or less of it in Russia or less of it in any other part of the world, you'll have less of it everywhere and the price will get reflected right away at the pump here, for instance. So if the Saudis tomorrow decide we're not producing our oil or we're going to cut by 5 million or we're going to add whatever, you would feel it almost immediately here anywhere in the United States. Okay, next slide. All right, and in order for all of that to exist, we need US military protection. And that is an important element in the equation. So the Saudis want US hegemony. The Saudis like the fact that the US is present in the region because the US is committed to an international order of trade that is free, that is stable. The US doesn't interfere, for instance, in Saudi production as to whether it's being sold in China or in Japan or somewhere else in the world, right? It allows for a kind of free market and still protects it. And that's actually an issue for us, and certainly I think an issue for someone like President Trump who says, like, why are we doing this for the Saudis or for the world or for the Chinese even? All these free riders are basically benefiting from an international system that we, the United States, protect and control, and it's one that we actually didn't invent. It's something we inherited from the British, because the British had this system before us, and yet we, the US taxpayer, has to pay for it. And that is, I think, a very legitimate question, and it's one where the president today was going to ask the Saudis, like, well, what are you doing for what we're providing, okay? And that's part of what is now changing. In the past, the US wouldn't have asked this question of the Saudis or of anyone else. Today, it is being asked. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, what I'm showing you here is a desalination plant. It's a plant that produces electricity and desalinates seawater to produce fresh water. Saudi Arabia has a population of about 36 million people. They don't have enough groundwater to satisfy their people. So what they need to do is they need to desalinate, which means burn fuel or gas to boil seawater in order to then make it into fresh water. And there are several technologies for doing this. But what it means is that if you attack one of these places, which Iran is capable of doing, you can basically stop the Saudis from having fresh water. Right? So the Iranians, because of their ability to hit oil installations, desalination installations, electricity generation installations, which they've threatened to do, and they have the capability of doing that, have the Saudis in a very vulnerable position. And that is something that the Saudis have to think about when thinking about the rivalry between Iran and the United States. So should the US attack Iran, or should Israel attack Iran, and the Iranians feel existentially threatened, what the Iranians would do is to try to disrupt the global economy, and the only way they can do that is by attacking Saudi Arabia's oil installations and desalination plants and so on. Saudis are very, very wary of that scenario, and they know that they're incapable of protecting their facilities because the distances are very short. They don't have the same ballistic and anti-missile technologies, anti-ballistic technologies that the Israelis and the Americans have. So they feel particularly vulnerable to an Iranian attack. And therefore are saying to the Americans, we want you, we like you, give us the technology to protect ourselves, but in the meantime, we don't want to disrupt relations with Iran, because what we're trying to do, and this is the new Saudi leadership, is to build and develop our country to move away from our dependence on oil. So next slide. So this is the king of Saudi Arabia today. He's basically not fully in charge at all anymore, and he has handed over the reins of power to his son, the crown prince. He acceded to the throne in 2015, but very soon afterwards decided that one of his sons was to be the most capable and competent to run the country, and this is a man called Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS. Next slide. This guy. So he's 38 or 39 years old now. He's been around in power really since 2015, so 10 years almost now, since his late 20s. And he is a very controversial figure. Many people in the West, especially leftists in America, human rights activists in America, and in the West in general, but also a lot of people in the media dislike him intensely because they see him as a ruthless autocrat. He's definitely an autocrat, and he's definitely ruthless if he needs to be. And he has a vision for his country, which he calls Vision 2030. And basically the vision is we are hugely dependent on oil revenues. We are vulnerable to the Iranians, and there's an energy transition that's happening in the world, and it is not possible for us to survive as long as we're this dependent on oil. We need to transition away from oil. We need to diversify our economy. We need to build new sectors that are not related to fossil fuels and to oil and to gas and to petrochemicals. In order to do that, we need to revamp our society completely. We have to stop talking about Islam as being the only reason for the existence of the state. We have to develop a new ideology centered on nationalism. We need to also become a normal society, which means that we can no longer have women not be allowed to drive. We cannot have women not allowed to go into the workforce. The women in Saudi Arabia are the more disciplined and the better educated half of society, so he needs to rely on them. He's not a feminist, but he needs to rely on the better human capital that he has, so he needs to kind of unleash the power of women in the economy. And he needs to allow for the religious zealots to stop harassing. He needs to get the religious zealots off the street so they don't harass people. So if guys want to walk with long hair or women want to dress without covering themselves, no one is to bother them. Because if you have a society where people have religious zealots running around, that society cannot be productive, it cannot be normal, it cannot have a sector or sectors, whether tourism or logistics or transportation or what have you, tech, that is dynamic, as long as people are running around forcing others to pray or forcing others to dress in certain ways. That's kind of his vision. And it's very oriented towards the United States, because he sees that the elite in the country is largely educated. Hundreds of thousands of Saudis were educated in the United States. English is the spoken language of that elite. The financial sector in the United States is the deepest and most liquid, so it's where Saudi wants to invest. The tech sector of the United States is the most dynamic in the world. That's the tech sector that he wants to bring into the country. So America is really, it not only helps defend the country, its military is American-based and American-equipped and trained. So America is what is the principal bilateral ally, the strategic ally, and at the same time, he wants to trade with China, to sell his oil to China, to import products from China. But China is more, you can think of, one way to think about how he thinks about the world is this. The relationship with the United States is a Catholic marriage. The relationship with China is a mistress, right? That's kind of how that's sort of, if you want to think about it in those terms. So you have a transactional relationship on one side, but you have like a serious relationship on the other. And it's for structural reasons. It's not because he loves America particularly, but it's because there are deep kind of architectural reasons for that relationship to be that way. Okay, let me see the next slide. Okay, so these are women driving now. So it's social liberalization, but no political opening. There is an economic opening. That's a mistake. Okay, next slide. And so here is what he's trying to do. He wants to make Saudi normal. So youth, the bulk of the population is something like 60 to 70% of the population is under the age of 35. He wants them to have fun. So religious establishment police gets constrained. He has musical concerts. He has internal tourism, entertainment, high tech, high finance, women in the workforce, ignoring the older generation. And by the way, anecdotally, when you go to Saudi Arabia, when you speak to young people, they love him. They think he's a rock star because he's promising all these things. You speak to older people, say anyone above 50, who are used to the old system with all the entitlements that the government used to provide, they don't like him at all. They think he's bad news because he's taking away things that they were used to. And of course, the end of political Islam. That's over. And so the next slide will show you a clip of him with an American journalist, and this guy is Masayoshi Son, who is the guy who runs something called SoftBank, and he invested heavily with him. And he, in this clip, talks about moderate Islam and crushing fundamentalism and the end of any form of extremism in the country. And they're out of the business of missionary activity, proselytizing, sending money, building mosques, madrasas. It's over. All of that is over. They're not interested in it anymore. Next slide. Okay, and so this is when the Saudis now talk about Islam, they send this gentleman around, and he's the head of the Muslim World League, which is a major Saudi religious institution, international institution funded by Saudi. And all he does is talk about tolerance and so on, and he's even been to Auschwitz, and he's prayed in Auschwitz. He talks about the horrors of the Holocaust. So it's a Saudi Arabia that is unrecognizable in terms of how they talk about the world, how they talk about other religions, how they talk about Jews in particular. Okay? And that contrasts very kind of starkly with how the Iranians talk about the world and how they talk about their religion and about Israel and about Jews and so on. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some just concluding thoughts. So basically we have a regional order in flux, and you have a failure of governance in many countries like Syria and Yemen and elsewhere, but not in Saudi Arabia. We still have a need for energy, and we need to be able to think about strategic choke points. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea are a case in point. And we see countries like Saudi Arabia hedging in the looming Cold War between the US and China. They still want to be US oriented, but they want to also deal with China as much as possible. And I'm going to stop here and then open it up to questions and answers. You can ask me about the Gaza plan, Trump's Gaza plan, about the Ukraine and Russian war that's now being negotiated in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia under the auspices of, or at the invitation of the Saudi Crown Prince. where you have the Americans and Russians talking to each other. So the Saudis are really playing a very important and dynamic role in the world, but it's one where they want stability, they want prosperity, they want international trade, they want American hegemony, and you have on the other side of the Gulf, Iran, that wants the end of the US, the end of Israel. They don't talk about development, prosperity, or any of those things. So that's the contrast between two radical visions for the region and for the world. One is kind of forward-looking, the Saudi one, and one is very much backward-looking and revisionist, the Iranian one. Thank you very much.
Right, so now we have some time for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
What are the prospects of the full diplomatic relations between House of Saud and Israel?
In Israel, yeah, that's a very good question. So this is normally called normalization. So let me back up a little bit to give you some context for normalization. So to do that, you need to look at the Biden administration. The Biden administration came to office January 2021. Very much seeing Saudi Arabia as a pariah. In fact, the president said that they're a pariah state and should be treated as such. Very angry at the human rights record of the Saudis, of what the Saudis had done in Yemen, in the civil war in Yemen, and essentially wanting to punish the Saudis. Then, so this was the influence of sort of the left wing of the Democrat Party that wanted to say that values rather than interests are what should guide US foreign policy. And in US foreign policy, that balance between values and interests is a constant tension in how we view the world, with some administrations being more on one side than the other. What happened with the Biden administration is that they started out with values, and they very quickly switched to interests. And the way they switched to interests had to do with oil price. So if you remember, by the end of 2021, we were coming out of the COVID pandemic, and the demand for oil was rapidly increasing. And so the price of oil was going very, very high by end of 2021. And I don't know if you remember this, but the cost of the gallon in California was close to $7 a gallon, and in New Jersey it was $5, and a lot of people were angry. And President Biden was looking at the midterm elections in 2022, and everyone was predicting a red wave, that the Republicans would win because of the economy and because of the price of oil. So Biden sends his national security advisor to Saudi Arabia and basically says, you're bad on human rights, but we want you to increase oil production to bring the price of oil down. And the Saudis basically say, no, we're not doing that. And so the Biden administration gets very upset, but things keep going. And then Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022. And then the Biden administration freaks out because they don't know what's going to happen to Russian oil. They don't know what's going to happen to the oil market. And if it goes haywire and price goes really high, then the midterm elections are gone. The Democrats lose. So Biden then flies to Saudi Arabia in July of 2022 to beg the Crown Prince to increase oil production so that the red wave doesn't happen, and to argue that you need to do this to mitigate the negative effects of the Russian invasion. The Saudis again say no. And Biden gets very upset, and he says, we're going to reassess the relationship, et cetera, et cetera. This was like the very bottom of the relationship at the time. Sorry, I'm going a little into the details of this because the details are kind of important for understanding the nature of the relationship between the US and Saudi. So then what happens is the Saudis say, okay, the Americans are clearly not upset with us, and they're always using the values business. They want us to increase oil production, which is going to harm us because we don't want lower oil prices. We're going to ask the Chinese to mediate the relationship, the dispute between us and the Iranians. And so by March of 2023, the Chinese in Beijing bring the Saudis and the Iranians together, and they sign an agreement where they basically say, it's all water under the bridge, we're going to try to improve relations. This freaks out the Biden administration because they think that the Chinese are coming into the Gulf and American hegemony and oil, et cetera, et cetera. So the Biden administration does about turn, complete 180-degree turn, and tells the Saudis, let's work on improving relations and do everything, and let's make interests, not values, be the determinant of our relationship. And then a series of agreements get negotiated, but never finally signed between the Biden administration and the Saudis, and that the Trump administration has now inherited. There are basically 5 agreements. So the first has to do with a mutual defense agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And if those 5 agreements are agreed to, the Saudis said they will normalize with Israel. So the first is a mutual defense agreement that would have to be voted on by the Senate. And you'd need 67 votes to pass it as a treaty. Then then the other thing they wanted was a free trade agreement. They wanted a nuclear agreement, a civilian nuclear power agreement between the United States and Saudi, so that the Saudis could have civilian nuclear processing and so on. And then they wanted also an artificial intelligence agreement where US artificial intelligence companies could set up server farms in Saudi Arabia with free energy and no regulation and lots of land. And the Saudis wanted this to develop their technological sector. And then the Saudis wanted a streamlined, easy process for purchasing weapons from the United States, where every time weapons were purchased, they didn't have to go through this tedious process through Congress. So if they got all of that, then they would normalize with Israel. Then October 7th happened. And one of the principal reasons why October 7th happened was the Palestinians, Hamas, and Iran did not want normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. They wanted to stop the normalization. And so they started this war, which then brought all these terrible images of suffering, and that has politicized the whole new generation of young people in Saudi Arabia. And while MBS is an autocrat, he still has to keep an eye on what his people think and feel. And they feel that the Palestinians deserve a viable state. So MBS said, I love these agreements and I'll sign them, but if you want me to normalize, I need you to do something for the Palestinians. And this is where we are today. Basically, the Saudis say they'll normalize, but we want some, I think they call them irreversible steps towards a viable Palestinian state, promised by the Israelis. And that's where things stand. And President Trump has now inherited this entire legacy from Biden of all these agreements and the possibility of normalization, but he needs to get the Israelis to do something so that the Saudis ultimately sign.
Well, can we just kind of forget the last 4 years and go back to Abraham framework and get Saudis that way? I'm very concerned about the nuclear need for Saudi Arabia, other than what they want to do is become a nuclear power. They don't need civilian nuclear power. They want to do the same thing Iran is doing.
A nuclear bomb?
Yeah.
It's possible. I mean, they've said, by the way, if the Iranians get a bomb, they will get a bomb.
Yeah.
And they've already, it's rumored that the Saudis were involved in the development of the Pakistani nuclear bomb. So presumably they could maybe buy it eventually from the Pakistanis. It's not clear. Anyway, at the moment, everything is in flux. And we really don't know where normalization stands. They will not normalize without one or more of the other agreements that they've already agreed to with the Biden administration. They're not going to give the Israelis peace without getting something for it. And they need that because they need to be able to turn to their people and say, you know what? Yes, the Palestinians didn't get the greatest deal, but look what we got for Saudi Arabia. I think that's where things basically stand. Yes?
What do you think of the future possibilities of a continued Iranian-Saudi detente? Because that's what the China deal kind of seems like.
Right.
It steps towards a general detente in the region between the two primary rivals.
Yes. So the Saudis want detente because they don't want the Iranians to attack them, which they did do, by the way, in September of 2019 when they attacked the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, the oil processing facilities of Saudi and one of the oil fields. The Iranians basically are willing to remain in the détente, but they want something for it. And so if you return to a maximum pressure campaign, which is what the president wants to do, which is basically reimpose sanctions, prevent the Iranians from selling oil, the Iranians are likely to maybe turn to more violent measures, not directly themselves, but through their proxies. And that's not something the Saudis want, because they would be the targets of the attack principally. So I know the Saudis want détente. I'm not sure. I don't think the Israelis want that. The Israelis probably want the Iranians to be attacked. Again, it's not clear where things are headed. Also, it's not clear whether the Iranians are going to push for a bomb or going to say, no, we're going to try to not make the bomb right away and see if there's some way to renegotiate something with the Americans. I mean, with President Trump, it's very difficult to predict because he himself is unpredictable, and his unpredictability is part of his negotiating tactic with these.
Madman theory?
Kind of. And sometimes it works because it scares the other side. I mean, the Europeans, for instance, now are saying, finally, we're going to spend the money on our military, which we haven't been spending. And that's only because Trump has said, bye, we're not protecting you anymore.
Paul?
Do you think that Saudi Arabia shares a similar fate as Iran, where people get so angry at a westernized Middle East and they choose to depose the monarch
Yeah.
and establish, like they did with the Shah?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And it's one that I think is something the Saudis are well aware of. So let me just unpack that question for a second for the rest of you. So the Shah of Iran, again, a pro-American, pro-Western, modernizing king, pushed the country of Iran very hard, very fast towards liberalizing the society. Women, the dress code, Islamic norms were removed, education, very, very powerful and fast modernization, but in a Western fashion. And that engendered a reaction from the more conservative and religious elements of society. Ultimately, some argue leading to the rise of Khomeini and the revolution that toppled him. So I think that in the case of Saudi Arabia, we're not seeing the same thing. It's slightly different. You have a liberalization of society, but what MBS is saying basically is Islam is very much part of our identity. If you want to be religious, you can be religious. No one's going to take away religion. I'm not anti-religious. But if someone doesn't want to be religious, that's their business. And you're not to interfere and annoy and bother them for not being religious. So it's more of a kind of live and let live, but we're still very much an Islamic society. Where I think matters might come to a head in the kind of Iran analogy sense is when alcohol is it comes to Saudi Arabia and they're going to have to permit alcohol to be sold. Because you can't have a major tourism industry that's attracting wealthy people from around the world without alcohol. That's just, part of the package. And that's when I think the regime is going to have to handle that situation very carefully. And I suspect what they will do is they'll say, we'll allow alcohol, but only in the kind of elite tourist resorts. And they'll be like gated communities. So and you can kind of see the Saudis working this out for themselves in interesting ways. So let me give you an example. It doesn't have to do with alcohol. So the Saudis have beaches along the Red Sea, as you know. And just outside Jeddah, there's a beach for Saudis. So this is a beach resort for Saudis. And if you go there, which I've done, what they do is they take your phone, and they'll put a sticker on the cameras, both in the front and the back. And you can go in, and you can and you'll see women in bikinis and people dressed any which way. but you have these people roaming around making sure no one's taking pictures. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that I think they've built into their society a way first of segregating people between those who are liberal and those who are not. So the non-liberals don't show up at these liberal places, liberal in quotes, meaning open, blah, 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 Western. And they also have these means of like making things private and secretive. So you'll have that for several years until things kind of mellow out, and so they'll manage the transition, is I guess what I'm saying, in a way, because they're aware of the Iran precedent. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So for the pager attack, while that was clearly effective in destroying the Hezbollah leadership structure, what were the civil considerations in that in terms of like the civilian populace? Because when you're using like something as indiscriminate as like a phone bomb, were there any, if any, like measures to target the Hezbollah more than the civilian populace, or was that just something that was?
Okay, so the Israelis had actually two. I mean, what happened was didn't happen in the right sequence. The original sequence of events was to start a war with Hezbollah, which they could legitimately say they could do because Hezbollah was the one that started firing at them first. And once you started a land invasion, the Hezbollah guys would all put on jackets and put the walkie-talkies on their breasts. It was the walkie-talkies that were supposed to blow up first, and that would have just killed soldiers. And the pager attack was supposed to be like a follow-on attack after the 15,000 guys were killed by the bombs of the walkie-talkies, because actually the bombs in the walkie-talkies were much bigger in terms of size and weight than the ones on the pagers. So this is all to say that in the end they couldn't start the war the way in the sequence that they wanted, so the walkie-talkies blew up second, and most of them blew up in storage and warehouses. The pager attack these were pagers that were carried by Hezbollah fighters principally, but not only. I mean, there was the Iranian ambassador had one too, and he was injured, which tells you that the Iranian ambassador was part of the organization. And there wasn't enough in there to really kill most people. There were very few people killed, but a lot of people were maimed because they held them or they had them in their pockets. And I don't think many non-Hezbollah people, I mean, a few people did, like if it started ringing and your daughter was asked to go and pick it up and brought it and then it blew up. But some people argued that this was a violation of the laws of war. And made the case that because it's an indiscriminate attack. But I think that, I mean, my own view, and I'm not an expert on the law of war, but if you blow something up that you know is only used by fighters, I don't see how that can be a violation of the laws of war.
Well, I guess I just didn't understand that they did have such a system to mark and track who had those pagers, it sounds like.
Yeah. Those pagers weren't given to everybody. They were only given to the fighters.
It just still seems bad. I mean, this is like, we're killing people.
Yeah, I know.
The whole thing, right? We just seem to be sitting here, it's fine. We're killing people in Ukraine, we're killing people in Gaza, we're killing people in Israel. I don't know, I'm sorry. I mean.
I know. That's the nature of war, though, unfortunately.
Well, it's pretty disturbing, and maybe we need to consider, you're coming at this very much as an academic, which I understand, I'm a geographer, but sometimes it would be helpful to remember that these are individuals, that we are trying to possibly figure out how to make peace. Just saying.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I appreciate your sentiment, but I grew up in the Middle East. I met a bunch of Hezbollah people, and they knew what they were doing. They were fighters, and fighters meet those kinds of fates very often in war.
So all sides is a problem.
Sorry?
All sides of people who are killing each other.
Yeah.
It'd be really lovely to have a conversation that says, how can we start to really address some of these kind of fundamental concerns that are not going to be any better because we are having more and more issues getting people out of their homes. I mean, so it's just kind of disheartening to sit here and listen to this as a very academic discussion. So I'm trying, but it's different.
This gentleman's been waiting for quite a long time. Right
Okay.
here, right here.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just kind of wonder, you being an expert on the topic, how do you think the balance of relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia are going to be moving forward with the Trump administration?
Yeah.
Because to me, and I could be told I'm ignorant on the specifics, but the relationship with Israel seems much less interest focused. Just since they're such a small nation, they don't have vast natural resources, especially like oil with Saudi Arabia. How do you see the balancing act?
You mean, so you're asking me like, will the United States become much closer to Saudi Arabia because there are more interests there than with Israel?
Yeah, I guess brass tacks. Do you think they're going to could you see a future closer relationship with Israel is deprioritized in favor of just pure national interest in maintaining oil prices
No, I mean, I think the Trump administration wants to have a very strong relationship and probably a strategic relationship with both countries.
Yeah.
I mean, because ultimately, I think what the American administration wants is to have very strong allies, I mean, militarily and strong allies, who can do the heavy lifting of any fighting or any policing of the region without having to send American troops. The idea is to kind of try to lessen the American footprint, military footprint. Huh?
like delegated? Almost?
Yeah, to have them kind of carry the burden. And so I think what you'll end up having is a push by the Americans to make the Saudis much more militarily capable and stronger, and to coordinate much more closely with the Israelis, but also with other countries who are allies of the U.S. So the U.S. can sort of back off a bit from this heavy footprint. As I said, I mean, the U.S. has almost on permanent deployment about 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the region. And there's a naval base in Bahrain, a major air base in Qatar, troops in Kuwait, something like 40,000 troops almost there all the time. That's a very heavy and taxing burden on the United States.
So you see Israel and Saudi Arabia's relationship as reconcilable?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and also to ultimately become much more coordinated when it comes to defense, especially vis-a-vis Iran, if Iran continues to be the spoiler that it is.
You think even with Trump's kind of strange stance on Gaza and Palestine?
Yeah, I think the thing with Gaza is so President Trump basically said the United States is going to take over Gaza without the U.S. military. It's going to effectively, forcibly remove the Gazan Palestinian population, which is around 2 million people. And then it's going to rebuild Gaza as a kind of Miami Beach on the Mediterranean. And I think that the Saudis, well, first of all, the Israelis didn't know that he had this plan until like an hour before the press conference he had with Netanyahu. But also, I think that the Saudis and the other Arabs see this as part of Trump's personality. So Trump basically says, this Palestinian thing has been going on for like 100 years. It's got to stop. I've had enough of it. I'm sick of it. And we got to think of radical out-of-the-box ideas to solve it. Here's my idea, which is like insane, basically, right? And that puts pressure on the Arabs to come up with a counteroffer that essentially says, we're going to rebuild Gaza. We're going to find a way to get Hamas, the military wing of Hamas, out of this territory, and we're going to fix it. And I think that's the intention behind the idea that he's floated. At least that's how the Saudis see it, and I think they're probably right. Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the de-Islamization policies in Saudi Arabia, I was just wondering if, because Iran uses that as a vulnerability for Saudi, if there was kind of a vulnerability in Iran that they could kind of counter that with. Like similar.
Yeah, so look, the Palestinian issue, the cause of the Palestinians, which is the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, meaning their right to have a state and a territory over which they're sovereign. That's an issue that's deeply affects the feelings and emotions and political kind of imagination of many Arabs and Muslims. They care deeply about the Palestinians for religious reasons and national reasons and other reasons. So the Saudi view is that as long as the Palestinians don't have a state, you'll have spoilers like Iran who will use the Palestinian issue, not really caring about the Palestinians, but they'll use this injustice towards the Palestinians as a way of radicalizing and destabilizing the region. And so the Saudis say, let's solve the Palestinian issue by giving them a state. Let's discuss the details of what that state looks like later. But if we give them a state, then we can take this spoiler card that the Iranians are constantly using to foment instability in the region. And so dealing with the Palestinians and their issues is not just for the Palestinians, but it's also for the larger goal of regional stability and security. Because without regional stability and security, you can't have development, you can't have prosperity, you can't have this vision that the Saudis have of a corridor of goods being traded from India and China all the way to Europe across the Middle East, right? And this hub and logistics and all the ideas that they have. So that's their point of view. Now the Iranians, their vulnerability, so if the vulnerability of the region and of the Saudis is the Palestinian issue, the Iranians have a vulnerability in that, first, most of their people don't like them, don't like the regime. So you can use the people of Iran against their regime. You can make life miserable for the Iranians by sanctioning them, sanctioning the regimes, preventing them from selling oil. So the Iranians are extremely vulnerable economically, they're vulnerable internally, domestically, through, because of their people being upset. They're also vulnerable because they've lost these proxy militias that they had around the region. But Iran itself is not existentially threatened, right? Iran is a very well-established ancient country, with an old civilization. The Iranian people are very nationalistic. So they're not vulnerable in that respect. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. One more there. Yes, sir.
So at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the last barrel consumed in the world will come from the Middle East.
Yep.
And it kind of defines it as like a finite resource. And then the crown prince's desire to move away from oil and modernizing Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Is that a desire to just stay with the times and advancing technologies, or do you think that he also can kind of see that as a potential problem in the future?
Yeah. So, again, I have to say, excellent students, very good questions. I'm assuming you're a student. Okay, so there was a Saudi oil minister in the 1970s who said, the Stone Age didn't end because the world ran out of stones, right? The Stone Age ended because there was the Iron Age. There was something better technology that made, stone flints obsolete. So the Saudis are very worried, like all oil producers are, that the oil that they have in the ground will never be sold. It'll become what is called a stranded asset, because we will move on to a technology that no longer needs oil, or that the oil becomes so cheap because no one wants it, that, because of a new technology, that it becomes effectively worthless. So the desire of the Crown Prince to develop and diversify his economy away from oil is both a fear about the stranded asset scenario or the fear that as a commodity, oil will just become virtually worthless. But he's still convinced that even when the price of oil is at, say, $10 a barrel, that barrel is not going to be coming from Canada or from shale or from ultra-deep oil in Brazil, but will be coming from Saudi Arabia. Because even at $10 a barrel, his cost of lifting it is $4, and he's making a $6 profit. You see?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again for such an illuminating presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.